to mean that he really gets involved in the mapping part of what we do and the actions that drive some of the activities and how we assess risk and how that affects rates. One of the things I want to do to set the stage here on Bigger Waters is to talk for a moment about how we got here. I came aboard in 2011. The discussion when I came aboard was about the need for reauthorizing the National Flood Insurance Act. It had gone through a number of reauthorizations, some of them relatively short, and in some cases it caused lapses in the program, which means that we may not have been able to write policies, or in some circumstances, if we'd had major disasters and we ran out of money, we would not be able to pay claims. So it was of a concern not only to FEMA, but also to a number of entities that are stakeholders and partners in this program, whether it's the Write Your Own companies, whether it's, frankly, the counties and the cities that participate in it, whether it's the insured themselves. There are a number of people that were involved in this. There had been some study and action going on in the background to look at what reform pieces may look like. And I will also tell you that part of the driver of that discussion, and I want folks to keep this in mind, was a re-engagement about what the proper role of the federal government in insurance should be. Part of the reason we got into the flood insurance business in the 60s really had to do a little bit with the insurance companies and perhaps an inability to really assess risk accurately enough to be able to underwrite it effectively without having large losses that caused them to go under. So a number of them backed away from the insurance business. We had a number of disasters in the United States at that time by flooding, and the federal government got in. At one point there was a partnership between private sector insurance and federal insurance and how we wrote and how we produced product. Later on it was taken on by the federal government. There has always been an element of not only providing the insurance but providing it affordable insurance. So when we talk a little bit later, it has a little bit to do with how subsidies came into play and why they were there, and also how we walked through grandfathering. So all of those were factors. The truth is the environment changed, our intelligence about insurance and assessing risk had changed, some of our processes had matured, and the question was being asked again, what was the proper role for insurance, for the federal government in insurance? Another part of that discussion in privatization was an ongoing one, is what would it take for the private sector to come back into the market? Well, two things, at least in the discussions I had, and Lee, you and I both sat on the National Advisory Council, and this was part of the discussion there at times, was how do we assess risk? What does it mean to make it stable? The program had gone into debt because of Hurricane Katrina, but also because of changes in policy on how the U.S. government viewed and handled that debt. There were a number of things going on. One of the things private sector insurers were telling us, in order for them to get in the market, two things needed to happen. One was that the rates needed to be actuarially sound, and what that meant is they needed to be able to charge a rate to cover their expenses and the cost of providing insurance. And in order for them to be in, they couldn't compete with the federal government in its subsidized rates. So we had to have a way of getting to a more actuarially based rate mechanism in which they could compete. The other part of that had to do with regulation. And if you talk to a number of the Write Your Own companies and other partners insurance, it is, in some cases, what they may perceive as unevenness in rate regulation and other regulation if they had to deal state by state with local insurance commissions rather than just dealing with the federal government. But all of that was part of the discussion. There was a discussion of the role for reinsurers, and they began to look at that market and how reinsurance played a role. We began to look at insurance pools and a number of other actions. But to set the stage for Bigger Waters, what FEMA asked for at that time, because what we were hearing more than anything else is we simply needed stability in the program long enough so we could look at reform and reform studies, so we could have these conversations And we ended up asking, and frankly, a kind of an unusual move. The administrator for FEMA asked Congress for a 5-year reauthorization. And it was a pure reauthorization. We didn't add any reform to it. We just simply said to provide stability in the program, we needed it to be authorized for a longer term. But that's what started the debate. And when I talk about the proper role, one of the criticisms that we often heard of the insurance program is because of our subsidized rates, we weren't fully stating the risk, and we actually promoted growth in high-risk areas to the detriment of the environment, to the detriment of the cost of disasters, and to the American taxpayer. We actually encouraged risky behaviors rather than discouraging it. So all those conversations were going on, and I mean that to set the stage, because when we talk about bigger waters, today we're going to talk about primarily 2 sections, Section 205, which is the removal of subsidies, and Section 207, which are mapping actions that have an effect of removing grandfathering and doing some other parts, and we'll talk about that. The part I would ask you to remember in that context is there are 47 other provisions in bigger waters that really speak to some of the issues. It asked, I think there are 7 or 8 studies that are required, including the affordability study. There's a study by the Federal Insurance Office on catastrophic insurance and whether we broaden coverage to other types of disaster. There are studies about how we look at mapping. There's a provision in the law that revises and has us create a technical mapping committee or council that provides information and advice to us on how we go through mapping and how that applies. There are provisions for independent review of maps, and maps, again, are one of those driving factors. So there are a number of sections within bigger waters, I think, that do present sound reforms for the program and update our methodologies, update our science, allows us to look at a number of things that actually make the program stronger. That said, on the first slide we're on, again, the main purposes here was to make the NFIP more financially stable. At that time, we were, I think, about $18 billion in debt, largely from the results of Hurricane Katrina. Since then, since the law went into effect, we've added Superstorm Sandy, and currently we're about $24 billion in debt. In order to move forward, we needed financial stability in the program. The other point, and I know Andy and the guys will talk about this, one of the misperceptions here is that what Bigger Waters was intended to do was to generate enough revenue in the program to pay off the debt. The actuarial rates that we're going to and what we're doing doesn't contemplate paying off the debt. It is about the risk and the risk assignment and the way we move forward relative to the risk we're facing, not necessarily a repayment of the debt. And we need to keep that in mind. And then the other had to do a little bit about changing behaviors, and it was triggering rate changes for certain properties within a revised or updated map area to accurately reflect the flood risk. And then the Section 205, which really had to do with the removal of subsidies, especially from non-primary residences, then later from businesses, and a discussion on removal of subsidies from severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss structures. It's important to know the difference between the subsidy piece and the grandfathering piece in this regard. A lot of the subsidies, what we're talking about is pre-flood insurance rate map properties that were subsidized into the system and received that subsidy into the system to promote a partnership and people to get into the insurance business or into the insurance pool. We provided those low rates and those subsidies. The mechanism for changing that, 205 and 207 are a little bit different, was a removal of the subsidies in 205, like I said, from non-primary residences, and those rates would go up on average 20% a year until they meet the full actuarial rate, which means depending on what the full actuarial rate was, and we'll talk about how that's determined, depending on what that be, your rate may increase by those 20% compounding increments over a number of years. It doesn't come all at once, except in a couple circumstances. If you'd allowed your policy to lapse, the sale of a property, the new owner goes to the full risk rate. If you allow your policy to lapse and then later pick it up, you go to the full risk rate. If you're a business, you're going to the full risk rate. If you're severe repetitive loss structures, you're going to move to the full risk rate. So 205 has that profound effect. I will tell you, as we have the ongoing discussion on how rates are affected, more of the discussion is on 207 because it affects primary residences than there has been discussion on 205. But it's important to know the difference, and we'll talk about the effect in communities here in a minute. Next slide, please. We began to talk early on about the removal of subsidies from non-primary residences. That went into effect, the law went into effect July 6th of that last year. We began to do the groundwork to set the stage in our business and practices to remove subsidies. You saw those beginning to be removed last summer. We did another round in October of this year for businesses. So the subsidized rates began to have, and we learned something from that as we went into communities. And it was the effect on the community itself. Two things happened. In order to remove the subsidies and know the rate going in, we had to do the actuarial stuff and the guidance that says this is what the new rate will be. And Biggert Waters helps determine the methodology that we apply to getting there, and Andy can talk about that. But as we removed that and people began to know what their risk rate would look like in its entirety and what they would buy this year, the discussion in communities was, you came in, you evaluated my property, you gave me the full risk rate, you told me over a period of time I'd be going from X thousand of dollars to perhaps tens of thousands of dollars, or $10,000 or more. And the fact is by doing that, you devalued my property. You changed the economic development and the economic climate within a community. That became a big part of the discussion, is what were the effects that we were having on home and home sales, even though it may not be primary residences. What were the effects that we were having on the economic viability of the community and how they move forward. It became the discussion about that cause and effect, which will be important when we talk about the affordability piece. The purchase of a subsidy-eligible property or allowing for the subsidy to subsidized policy to lapse, repetitive loss, those things again became triggers. One of the other pieces of that and how it affects home sales is while a subsidized property owner that was there and stayed there may see an increase at 20% a year till they reach the full rate, those other triggering events meant that people that were buying a property would go to the full rate. Again, that was a dampening of the climate for home sales is what we began to hear. There were some homes, because when they found the new rate, and there was a lapse of time here from when the law went into effect and when we were able to execute it. So what people knew when and how that affected later home sales, all of that comes into play because of 205. The other part of the law, though, that we began to hear separate from 205, and we have actually not implemented nor have we begun to implement yet, is Section 207. One of the things that drives our action in a lot of what we do are mapping and mapping changes. And folks, we've always done mapping updated changes. A number of years ago, we did map modernization, which was an effort to digitize our maps and bring them up to date in that manner. We've moved to risk map, which is a new application of the science. You've seen other things come along in the last year, like LAMP, a levy process by which we look at levies and the protection provided by levies as a part of the mapping process and how that affects the hydrology and the hydraulics in an area and how that may affect rates. There are things that we've moved along in the mapping science. And that is also meant to say this, is that the risk is ever changing. And we go in a period of time, and Doug can talk about how we schedule it, but bottom line is there's a requirement that we have to look at maps every 5 years. It doesn't mean we'll change them. but in effect to look at maps on a 5-year schedule that says, are they ripe for update, should be updated, is there more current information, has there been a significant change in risk that would cause us to update maps. So this is an ever-evolving piece as we go through it. One of the things that we heard that I don't want to forget in the discussion as we discussed maps, and we heard it in areas that had been affected by disaster, who built to a FEMA standard. Now we're talking about post-firm policy properties, talking about primary residences and post-flood insurance rate map policies. What we often heard is, FEMA, you told us what the regulation was. You told us how we needed to build. We built to those standards and those conditions, and now you're changing the rules on us, and you're making us either rebuild to a higher standard, or you're going to penalize us for the new standard and charge us a higher rate. And the answer to that was yes. What we'd always said in grandfathering is if you bought your property and you had this rate, even though the risk may change, if you don't sell your property, you're able to keep your insurance at this risk, at this rate. That changed because of bigger waters. And that's a big part of the discussion today. It's about how mapping changes will have the effect on premiums and what we charge for those premiums. One of the things I'd like to say too, before we get too far ahead, because Lee, I've got to leave at 1:30, but and I know I want to allow some time for questions for me, but again, Andy and Roy are here to talk about mapping and actuarial science. The discussion in 207 now, what occurred in Congress this last week in the Budget Act, delays the actions we can take, the money we can spend on implementing 207 and the actions we can take. One of the things that I want to make clear, and we'll be putting out further guidance on this in the next couple weeks, are those actions that are independent of 207. They may have an effect, but they've always been independent, and mapping is one of those. We've always done it. We will. It may not be the trigger for premium increases, but it doesn't mean we will stop our mapping actions is one of those circumstances. There are other things in the program we will continue to do, and I think it will behoove all of us to outline exactly what those are so there isn't confusion. So while it removes the trigger and it stops our implementation of the premium increases related to mapping, the truth is the mapping itself will continue to happen. And right now there is a recognition that the discussion on maps, a statement of risk and what risk begins to look like, the fact that people know that if they are now, were once above base flood elevation and they're now below, it will ultimately have be a large determining factor in the premiums that they pay. That discussion will continue. What the uncertainty is what the final solution that Congress may look at, what that will be. And the other part is while we have this reprieve in the Budget Act, it is a 1 year connected to the budget. So the question is, if Congress doesn't act, will there be an effort to make that continue on, or do we simply delay 207 to another date and kick that can down the road? So with that, Lee, I'll open to questions before we go on, and folks, we can get into, like I said, the actuarial parts and how we walk through those and how things are modeled, as well as mapping, the mapping changes, how we schedule mapping, how we look at mapping, and community partnership that we look at in those areas.
Okay. Thank you, David, and I'm going to open this for questions at this time. And questions again are provided through the GoToWebinar to the league staff, and I'll turn it over to the league staff to give us what questions we've received.
Thank you, Lee. Our first question is, when can we expect to see the final report on affordability and the report on reinsurance and privatization of the program?
With regard to the report on affordability, one of the things that happened there, within Bigger Waters, there was a prescriptive piece on the affordability report. One was that we do it with the National Academies of Science, and number two was the amount of money appropriated to do that. Early on, what the National Academies said was, we cannot do it in the time frame that Congress allowed for us, and I think it was within 100 and some days. I'd have to look at the law again, but it was a relatively short time frame. But the Academy said we can't do it within the time frame, nor can we do it with the amount of money that Congress appropriates. One of the things that is being sought in the affordability study is, number one, is what can we do now? And we've been talking to the Academy, and we're getting ready to kick off the beginnings of that study, looking at the scope and nature of it. Andy may be able to give us a little more information on the time frame for that. But the other part that we were looking at in legislation is if Congress acted to appropriate more money for it or allowed us a flexibility in using the flood insurance fund to pay for the study, and then again working with the national academies to look at the time frame by which that could be completed. Andy, do you have an update on this negotiation with the Academy and where we are now and where we're going?
So the affordability study has been procured, and that's a federal process that is really interesting to watch happen. I didn't start out as a federal employee, and so watching the way the federal government procures things, there's lots of boxes you have to check, lots of requirements in order to procure a study. But that study has been procured. That occurred last September. Its period of performance began at the point of procurement in September. It's going to go through March of 2015. And phase one of that study is basically to determine how do you analyze the affordability of removing grandfathering, of removing subsidies, and doing things like putting vouchers where there's an affordability concern when, due to the way the program has grandfathered and subsidized these properties, the current risk of those properties is by and large an unknown for those that are perhaps most at risk. And so with that level of uncertainty in what we know today, how do you begin to talk about the affordability? So the National Academy of Sciences broke it out in two pieces. One piece to figure out how do you even do a study like that, and that's phase one that goes through March of 2015. And then a likely outcome of that study will be a number of options to say if you want to do the study quickly, but maybe you're going to have to rely on really rough data estimates. Here's one method that you could use. If you want to do a real rigorous study, here's another method you could use with different time frames and costs involved for the study. And then phase two will act on what is found out in phase one. So what is a reasonable approach to doing the study? And then that's phase one, and then phase two actually carries out that approach. And so to some extent, to talk about when it would be done depends a lot on what the results of phase one are. If the results of phase one says, you know, there's a data gap that's hard to fill and it's almost impossible to fill, and so the best you can use is a really approximate technique that's the back of a napkin in some restaurant, then that will be a very quick study. If it's something that says you can do this, but it's going to require you to undertake a pretty significant level of effort to get a decent answer out of this, it's going to take a long time, well then it could take a long time. So it's a little bit hard for us to gauge when the study will be complete until the National Academy of Sciences determines appropriate approaches. And the last thing I'll say about the National Academy of Sciences is that they really focus on what would stand up to a defensible peer-reviewed argument. So they're not interested in just giving an answer because we've asked them for an answer, but they want an answer that is defensible within a peer-reviewed environment. And so that's one of the advantages of using them.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is as we continue to have these discussions, and frankly discussions go on around the study, as Andy kind of alluded, it affects the scope and the nature of it. Part of what I think everybody was looking at the front piece is if premiums were going to go up, it really was based on somebody's ability or to pay the premium. And when we look at an income means test in order to subsidize or help people pay their premium, and subsidize becomes a bad word. So what it meant is I'll let you know your full risk rate. I'll look at an incomes means test maybe to determine how much of that you can pay, and we may voucher part of it and help pay that premium. That was the thought going into it. But as we had other discussions on the effects of community, on the devaluation of property, on a number of other things, it may change the scope and nature of this. Again, the Academy will find that out as they go through the beginning of it and talk about the possibilities and the rigor of their work.
Okay. David, do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, the last part on that one, Lee, that I want to add is the other part, unless Congress acts differently, folks, is while the affordability study is there, Currently, it is not tied to the implementation of 205 or 207. So it tells us to look at it. It doesn't really tell us what to do with it or how Congress will act relative to that. And I know that's of importance in communities all across the country, is what do we do with the information once we have it.
Okay. Amber, our next question.
Does FEMA have numbers by the state for the number of grandfathered policies that may lose their subsidies, i.e. policies impacted by 207 in my state?
Yeah, and I'll let Doug talk to it a little bit. What we know more is subsidized properties. Those affected by 205 represent about roughly about 20% of our total policy count, and that one we can kind of figure out. What's harder, because of the mapping actions that we take, we can get an estimate of what we're going to map in a given year and what it's going to look like. What we can't predetermine is the effect of that mapping action. In many places we go, it means in some cases people's risk will increase or they'll be newly mapped into a special flood hazard area. In other cases, they actually may be mapped out of the SFHA, or they may be fined that they're now significantly above the base flood elevation, and they may actually see a decrease in their premiums accordingly. So to give numbers on who's affected and how they're affected because of the mapping actions and that grandfathering piece is much tougher for us, and we do not have the exact numbers around that.
Okay. David, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule today to join us, and I just want to emphasize that as you know, this is a very large issue for the state of Florida, and any assistance that we can provide to you and to FEMA, we would be glad to do.
Well, I would invite this, Lee. Communities are affected, and Florida, of course, has a major part of the policies we offer, and thus represents a lot of the property that we protect. I think there are two parts of the discussion that we always are open to data. And it is data on mapping and mapping actions, and more importantly, I know it's a follow-on to the conversation, is the mitigative things that happen as a result of that as we look at risk and risk assessment, how communities participate in the CRS and in effect buy down their risk and buy down premium. That data is important to us. But also in this discussion, there's a lot of supposition on the economic effect on communities. And each area, whether it's Florida or New Jersey or subdivisions thereof, it will affect them differently about what drives their economies. If somebody leaves, what else comes in? What's the changing demographic or geographic in an area? Data that we have about that always helps us. And I realize it's supplied as part of the argument for and against certain provisions of the law. I'm okay with that. But we'd like to see the data as well and how that's analyzed in the lens that communities are using to look at that information.
So again, thank you for your time. And we're going to move on to the next part of the webinar, which is to talk about the community rating system. As one of David's slides indicated, the community rating system, or CRS, is an effective tool that cities can use to help reduce the flood insurance premiums of our property owners. I'd like to turn this over now to Sue Hoffensberger and ask Sue to talk about the CRS program in the state of Florida. Sue?
Great. Hi. Hello, everybody. And Lee and League, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk about the community rating system to a good large group of people. And I'd like to start out by asking if any of the panelists or listeners, as I'm going through the presentation, I've got to go through it pretty quickly, and there will be a lot of information that if you hear something that didn't sound right or it doesn't come across professionally clear or clean, share that with me so I can make those considerations going forward with additional presentations, either webinar or face-to-face. I gave this presentation earlier today down in Jacksonville, so please, I'm always open to constructive criticism. But, and you did pronounce my last name correctly, Lee. It's Hoffensperger. I am the ISO CRS specialist for a portion of the state of Florida. I have two associates that work other sections of Florida, since Florida is so intensive in the community rating system program. And just so you know, that the territory I carry is if you go down to Volusia County and draw a straight line across to the west to Pasco County, and north of that in Florida is the territory that I cover, and I include, I also cover coastal Georgia. So the center of the state and the south of the state are so intensive that they're handled by 2 additional people. So there's 3 of us only in Florida. There are 16 ISO CRS specialists across the country, about 16, and where there's 3 ISO specialists in Florida, there may be 1 ISO specialist that handles 5 states and has as many communities as I have, not 75. So you can see floodplain management across the United States is very different. I handle about 45 counties and about 75 communities. In South Florida, it's about 4 counties and 75 communities. So just within the state of Florida, you can see that floodplain management is different, and this is a national program. So it's got to be a program that kind of is a fit for communities with floodplain management concerns all across the diverse country that we live in. So I'm based out of Fernandina Beach, and just so you all know what the part that ISO plays with the community rating system is, we administer this program for FEMA. It is a FEMA program. We listen to them. They tell us how they want the program managed and administered. They give us guidance. So it is a FEMA program. And how ISO got involved in it is, we have other programs that ISO has been doing since the 60s in classifications of communities. One, some of you folks may be familiar with, is like the fire code and the fire safety rating, that your fire safety and property safety and emergency management teams get. We've been looking at things like how well educated are your emergency management folks? How many emergency responses do they have annually? How many people do they have per capita that's going to cover all those? Where are your fire hydrants? How easy are they to find? Are they GPS, or are they somehow else easily located? All this data was brought together. The numbers are crunched, and you're able to quantify a classification. That classification has a positive effect on your insurance, your homeowner's insurance. So ISO also does what's called a Building Code Effectiveness Rating Schedule. That's where we call that BSEG, that's the acronym. And what that is we've gone in and we've looked at building departments, and this is a voluntary program. We go in and we look at building departments. How many inspectors? How many code enforcement officers? Is the building official certified? How many inspections do they do? How many permits are pulled a year? All these kinds of factors are looked at, including your building code. How stringent is your building code? Those kinds of things are looked at and quantified, and you're given a BSEG rating. If you participate in that BSEG rating, you have a classification that has a positive effect on your homeowner's insurance. Because building codes and building departments are so tightly interwoven with floodplain management, that BSEG rating has an effect on your community rating system classification as well. One, it does provide you some creditable points in the CRS if you participate. And also it's important enough for the program to say, if you don't participate in BSEG or your classification is too low, then there are certain CRS classifications you cannot make. You cannot become a CRS class 4 or better if you have a BSEG rating that's too low or is non-existent. So when the NFIP was created in '68 as a way to fund disaster relief, previously it had been taxpayers' dollars, that they said, okay, we're going to present this flood insurance, this affordable flood insurance, which is now available, And you can argue the point, what is affordable? Well, I would say that the NFIP policies are affordable when you compare them to private insurance policies. So the premiums that are paid into this help pay for the disaster relief, and the NFIP policies are only available in communities that have jumped through some hoops and have shown that they are minimally compliant with the requirements. Certain codes have to be part of your flood damage prevention ordinance and your building codes. You have to provide certain activities such as some record keeping as far as base flood elevations as it relates to your finished floor, those kinds of things. And you have to have adopted these minimum standards in order to have these policies available in your community. And once having said that, there are communities out there that are not minimally compliant and do not have these affordable NFIP policies available to them. So ISO, when FEMA realized that people were doing above and beyond the minimum NFIP, have said, ooh, how do we quantify this, and how do we encourage them to do more and more above the minimum NFIP, and how do we quantify that so we can do something to provide them some sort of benefit in continuing to implement that. I just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page about the mandatory purchase of flood insurance. There's a lot of misinformation going on out there. The bottom line is, if you have a federally backed mortgage or line of credit on your home and you choose to live in the flood hazard area, the high hazard special flood hazard area, otherwise known as the 100-year floodplain, you are required by the federal government to have flood insurance, and these flood insurance policies are available to you. Now, if you do not have a federally backed line of mortgage or a line of credit on the home, and you live in the high hazard area, you're not required by the federal government to have insurance, but the policies are still available to you, and they will be at that subsidized rate because you don't have a federally backed mortgage. If you have a home that is not in the special flood hazard area and you still want to buy flood insurance, it's a good idea to buy flood insurance because at least 26% of the flooding and catastrophic damage that occurs to homes because of flooding occurs in these what people say are low hazard areas, or people may be mistaken and say, I don't live in a flood zone. Well, everybody lives in a flood zone. It's just what the risk level is. So if you build a home or buy a home in the outside of that 100-year floodplain or not in the special flood hazard area, you can still buy affordable flood insurance at that subsidized rate. Okay, we're all on the same page about that. What people don't understand is when they get a letter from their insurance, their homeowner's insurance company, or maybe their lending institution where it's not a federally backed line of credit, and they get that letter saying, as a condition of this, you're supposed to have flood insurance. If you don't get it, we'll get it for you. And that is not the federal government telling you have to have flood insurance. That is your homeowner's insurance or your lending institution saying, if you want this product from our company, a prerequisite for that is you get flood insurance. And a lot of people think that the federal government's all of a sudden telling them they have to have flood insurance where they've never had to have it before. And they're saying, no, if you want this product from our company, whether it's a home insurance policy or a non-federally backed loan, we want you to have flood insurance. You're welcome to go find another homeowner's insurance company or lending institution that's not going to require you to have flood insurance. But let's just keep straight that the mandatory purchase of flood insurance through the federal government is if you have a federally backed line of credit or mortgage on the home, or if you've paid it off and you want to refinance it or maybe get some equity out of it by getting a line of credit on your home and it's federally backed, all of a sudden you're going to be told you have to have flood insurance through the federal government. So I hope everybody's kind of understands that and is on the same page about that. So it was in about 1990 when FEMA started saying we need to find some way to give a benefit to the communities that are doing above and beyond the minimum NFIP. And ISO, because of the experience we've had in classifications of communities, thought we had a pretty good program and a pretty good template to work from. That's why ISO is doing what we're doing now to for the community rating system. So what the community rating system does is it provides national recognition to communities who exceed that NFIP minimum standard by creating new and improving existing management programs, and it provides the benefit of discounts on those flood insurance premiums for their residents. That is, the discounts are applied to those people that are required to have flood insurance, a mandatory purchase, because they have a federally backed loan of, line of credit or loan, and they've decided they want to build or buy in the special flood hazard area. Okay? And what do some of the statistics show us about flood insurance? The statistics show that over the life of a 30-year mortgage or home is, I think the number is at least 30% more apt to be lost by catastrophic flood events than fire. And also that about 26% of flooding occurs outside of the high hazard area. So people who say I'm not in a flood zone or I'm not near water, 26% of those people don't realize that they're going to experience some flooding. The other statistics that are fairly recent show that when a flood occurs, that if there's a high policy count in relation to insurable structures, if that rate is high, that the community is going to bounce back faster. You know, insurance is there to help us, not make us whole. But if you have flood insurance and there's a flood, your community as a whole is going to bounce back faster, and it's going to bounce back and be much more strong as a community afterwards. So it's incumbent upon the CRS communities to promote the purchase of flood insurance, make sure that your folks are adequately insured, not overinsured, not underinsured, and that they have contents coverage. So those are all benefits of the CRS program and goals of the CRS program, including the safety of life and property. So hang on a second. I'm trying to advance the screen. There we go. So it's a FEMA program administered by ISO. It is voluntary, a voluntary program. And it's a way of quantifying your floodplain management efforts above and beyond the minimum NFIP. You may be doing some great floodplain management activities, but you're not going to get credited for it in the community rating system because it's probably minimum NFIP. Keep doing it. It's good to keep doing it. It's based on 19 creditable activities, and it's based on a 10-class system. There's 500 points per class. So if you're doing activities up to about 499 credits, you're class 10, you're not really participating, you're not recognizing any benefits for those additional high standards. From 500 credits to 999, you become a CRS class 9. That's a 5% discount. Okay? So if you get another 500 credits, you're a CRS class 8, so the folks who are required to have insurance are getting a 10% discount, and so forth and so on until you find yourself in one of these points categories at a CRS class discount. All right? So what kinds of activities are we talking about? We look at series of activities, and they're done by number. The 300 series is all about public information. The 400 series is all about mapping to higher regulatory standards or higher regulatory standards. The 500 series is about flood damage reduction, and the 600 series is about flood warning and flood preparedness. I don't want to go into a large amount of detail about each of these activities, but I do want to cover some of them a little bit in depth. When I talk about the 300 series being about public information, this is what is the community doing to get the information out to the public about flood safety, flood insurance, flood warning, any of those things, how to protect yourself and how to protect your property. So elevation certificates is one of those. The elevation certificate is an OMB document that records a lot of data, including your finished floor elevation as it relates to the base flood elevation. And the elevation certificate is what is used by insurance agents to rate your policy. So the CRS program says if you're a CRS community, you are required to keep all that information that you said you were going to as a minimally compliant NFIP program. You're required to do that now on the OMB document called an elevation certificate. And in addition to that, just because a surveyor's or an engineer's seal is on it does not necessarily mean it is filled out correctly. You and I all have tried to fill out the OMB forms like tax returns or financial documents to try to get grants or whatever the case may be, health care information. You have all the information, you just may not be putting it in the right place on the document and you need some help. Well, the elevation certificate is a form that we're not questioning a surveyor's ability to shoot an elevation, but we do want to make sure that any element on that or any item on that elevation certificate that's going to affect that person's rating on the policy is filled out accurately and completely. So it's incumbent upon the CRS community, once they volunteer for the program, that not only will they take elevation certificates for all new construction and substantial improvement in a special flood hazard area, but before they go any further, they're going to check it for errors and make sure that the errors and omissions are corrected. The other required element is down in the 500 series. It's for, it's actually called 501 or 502. It's not outlined in this table of contents. It's all about repetitive losses. Repetitive losses are structures that have seen flood losses or flood claims against them twice in a rolling 10-year period equaling $1,000 or more. And for a CRS community, in order to remain in the program, every year you need to take a look at your repetitive loss structures. You need to determine what other properties, insurable properties in the area, could have been affected by that same flooding risk, and do an outreach to them. A neighboring property may not be on the repetitive loss list, but they may have had, that's because they may have only had only one flood claim in the last 10 years. So you're not going to see it as a repetitive loss property. Or they may own the home outright, not required to have insurance. They may have been flooded 3 or 4 times, but you wouldn't see that. So it's incumbent upon the CRS community to stay in the program, is to send out an outreach that addresses certain things about personal safety, property safety, flood insurance, and potential avenues of financial assistance if you want to elevate your home or relocate your home or do any type of retrofitting, that there are grants or monies available for that. So those are the 2 required elements. The rest of the elements in Activity 300 are all about, hey, if I call the community and I want to know, I'm considering buying a home or building a home, is this property in the special flood hazard area, and what does that mean for me as far as mandatory purchase flood insurance? And do you have a copy of an elevation certificate on that property from a previous owner? Those are, that's a higher regulatory, or that's a higher standard than what you're required to do. If you're doing that, you get credit for that. Also, if you're able to tell them that they're in a maybe a coastal erosion zone, or that you're in an area that's near wetlands, it might have some buffer requirements if you're going to do any improvements on the property, those kinds of things. Then there's your general outreach projects that you send out in the mail or in the newspaper, or those front pages for storm weather in the phone book, anything that you might do as far as a hurricane guide, or if your local weather station has a hurricane guide out there. Any kind of printed material or cable overrides, things like that, are where you're going to get credit in the 330 series of activities. 340 hazard disclosure is all about how do you make sure people know before they purchase or commit any money to a property if it's in the flood zone. Okay, these are, things like making sure that you have it written in your procedures that the flood zone is on your final plat, registered on your final plat. Do you have any disclosure requirements if a property is near a buffer zone or a coastal construction control line? Do you require realtors to impart that information for good-faith monies put down? That's the kind of activity you're going to get credit for in 340. 350 is all about flood protection information in your library and on your website. Okay? 360 is that the activity that every community does, because if you don't, then your governing body hears about it. This is when somebody calls and is concerned about localized flooding, or they have a neighbor who's brought in some fill for their wonderful new landscaping and now all their water's draining onto your lot. How do you respond to those people and what do you do? Okay, so that's additional credit. All communities do that. If not, like I said, the person complaining is going to go straight to your governing body. It's just how do you record it and how do you actually document that you're doing that. I'm not going to talk about 370 right now because there are some issues that we're still talking about in that. That's a new element in the new manual. So the 400 series is all about mapping. Let's say you look at your firm, your flood insurance rate map, but you know that there are areas that are not on that term that are flooding and that are at higher risk. So you map those areas and you decide that you are going to regulate those areas just like they were in the high hazard area on your flood insurance rate map. And so you get credit for mapping those areas and regulating those areas just like they were in the floodplain. So the mapping element also comes into play when you're looking at open space. When we talk about open space, we're talking about in the special flood hazard area, in the 100-year floodplain, what are you doing to discourage people building in the floodplain? We're talking about parks, wetlands, any other protected area, low-density zoning, open space incentives like cluster developments or tax incentives for not building in the floodplain. Those are the kinds of open space preservation credits you're getting. Higher regulatory standards are, do you have a foot of freeboard? Do you require engineered foundations? Do you allow mobile homes in the 100-year flood zone? Is your staff, are any of your staff certified floodplain managers or been through the training? These are the kinds of activities that you're going to get credit for. Erosion and sediment and control, water quality, stormwater management, watershed master planning regulations, all those things are credited in the 400 series. The 500 series, we talked about repetitive loss properties. The 510 series is about floodplain management planning. For the most part in Florida, that is a local mitigation strategy that people earn credit for, communities earn credit for, or maybe it's a comprehensive emergency management plan where those floodplain management credits are earned from. And then acquisition and location of repetitive loss properties or anything in the floodplain that you say, hey, this property consistently gets flooded. We're going to purchase this from the owner and make it into a park or a retention area. Or we're going to get a grant and have the structure actually picked up and moved. That's where that 520 credit acquisition and relocation is from. Activity 530 is about flood protection. These are structural flood control projects or big stormwater projects that mitigate areas that typically have flooded. You'll earn credit there. And 540 is the drainage maintenance. This is all about your storage basin maintenance, your conveyance maintenance for stormwater within the community. It's not the regulation that's credited in 500. It's the day-to-day maintenance of your stormwater and conveyance areas. Then the 600 is all about warning and response, and 630 got cut off, but 610 is about your flood warning and response, your reverse 911. When does the EOC, your Emergency Operations Center, go into action, and what are those plans, and how are they keyed to weather and flood stages? 620 is about any levee safety programs, and 630 is about dam safety. So that might have been a little bit more information than you wanted, but at least you get an idea what kind of higher regulatory activities we're talking about. In the state of Florida, because watershed mass, because water management districts require higher regulatory standards than the minimum NFIP, and the Florida Building Code. Florida is one of the states that has one of the most stringent building codes. That's because there are things that you are required to do above and beyond the minimum NFIP simply because you're in a water management district or in the state, that you earn those credits automatically. And I will tell you that most communities in Florida, simply based on uniform minimum credit and what they're typically doing day to day anyway, can get into the CRS program at a CRS Class 9 without much difficulty at all. It's just getting into the program itself, and we'll talk about that in a second. The statistics for the community rating system is right now across the country there are about 1,273 communities in the CRS program. The national average is that about 48% are a Class 7 or better. I can tell you in Florida that percentage is more like 70% of the communities in Florida are a CRS Class 7 or better. That means they're CRS Class 7, 6, or 5. We do not have any 4s yet in Florida. Me and my counterparts across the country, we do about 250 cycle verifications annually. When you become a CRS community, we come out and we re-verify all your credit every 5 years. In between that, we do an annual recertification where we send you a packet that says, hey, last cycle visit, you promised us you were doing this. Are you still doing it? And then you just initial it and say, yes, we're still doing that. Some of those statements require minimal documentation, like your log that you're keeping when somebody calls in and says, I'm looking to buy in a floodplain, or I'm looking to buy a house that lives in the floodplain, and what's the mandatory purchase of flood insurance requirements for that. You're documenting that, you're keeping a log of that, and so with annual recertification, we ask for some minimal documentation like that. And we bring in approximately 20 to 30 new communities into the community rating system every year. So what are the benefits? The benefits are insurance. Your insurance savings locked up the cost of the program. You'll have improved floodplain protection. Your programs become better organized because as you realize you need to document some of these things, the community may realize that their standard operating procedures may need to be tightened up some. You'll have national benchmarks and local benchmarks that you can evaluate yourself against, and there's a lot of pretty technical assistance available to help you and give you incentive to keep implementing. So what's the first thing to get into the community rating system is you need to send a letter of interest, an LOI, to your FEMA region. In Florida, that's FEMA Region 4. And what that does is triggers the FEMA region to know that they have to go out to your community and do what's called the Community Assistance Visit. That's a CAV. When we say you have to pass the CAV, that's when FEMA comes out and looks at your elevation certificates, looks at your building codes and your standards, looks at a whole bunch of things and says, yes, you are still minimally compliant with the NFIP program, so you're in good standing with the NFIP program, and you're meeting all the minimum requirements. Now the CRS community or the CRS specialist from ISO can go in there and take your application. This has to be done within 6 months of the TAP being cleared. Having said that, once you send your letter of interest into FEMA, I do not know how long it will take FEMA to get out there. I don't know if the 2014 budgets for Region 4 have been fixed. Sometimes, a lot of times, they'll coordinate with the state to ask someone from the state NFIP office to go out and do the community assistance visit. But if you send your letter of interest in, it may be 6 to 8 months before FEMA can get out there or longer. And then if they find any compliance issues or something that they need you to modify in your ordinance, then you've got to get all that taken care of before FEMA will send you a letter saying, yes, you're minimally compliant with the NFIP. So now you can we contacted ISO and told them to start your new application process. I just wanted to set that expectation up front. You don't send a letter of interest in and boom, next week you're in. Okay, it can take a year and a half to get the application in. Okay. So once that's done, you need to make sure you designate a good CRS coordinator. Make sure somebody who can coordinate between all the departments. You need to implement your creditable activities. You need to do your annual recertifications by October every year. You need to maintain your ECs, address your repetitive loss issue, and maintain records of documentation for the rest of the activities. So this is just a list of the classifications across the country. There are 199. You can see 5 of them are in Florida. And as you go down the list, you can see that as we get to a CRS Class 7, you've got 80 of the communities that are in Florida are Class 7, 64 are Class 6s, and 18 are Class 5. All right, and you can see off to the left which communities in the United States are Class 1, 2, and 3. I know we're running out of time here, but since this is being recorded, you can go back and review some of these slides, but this kind of tells you a summary of the Class 5 communities, who they are in Florida. And then this slide, I know it's busy. I'm sorry, it's this slide that's busy, but it kind of looks at that statement, and it says, it looks at this statement, which is a what-if statement. This is for Fernandina Beach, a snapshot in time. It says they're a CRS Class 6. They have 3,652 policies enforced in the NFIP. 896 of them are in the SFHA. So as a CRS Class 6, they are saving those folks who are required by the federal government to have flood insurance $183 on average a year on their NFIP policies. Community-wide, that's almost $200,000 a year they're saving their community by participating in the CRS. So with Bigger Waters, this program is becoming more and more important, and a lot of communities are really working hard to improve their class, not just because of the savings, but because it's good floodplain management for them. So these kinds of what-if statements are available for any NFIP community, and you can request that. Those summaries are what I have summarized at this table. For example, Fernandina Beach, the total policies in force, the CRS rating the savings, the policies in force that are in the SFHA, and what those savings are. So I've used some of the communities that are in my area and just summarized that table for your edification should you be interested. All right, the help, of course, is from the state through FEMA. We have publications. There's the CRS website. Other communities that are CRS communities, I'm here to help. The task force members that develop the program, and, of course, your state and the National Association of Floodplain Management. The website is, sorry about that, the website is crsresources.org. We say never reinvent the wheel, plagiarize. When you get in the program, you can get on this website, you can download the manual, but also there's help here, like in the 300 series, they have examples of outreach that you can plagiarize. They have examples of elevation certificates and how to check them for errors. And most importantly, it kind of cut off, but underneath this download the document, there's a quick guide. That's for communities that are not in the program. They want to see if they've got enough credits and things they're already doing to at least get in the program, and then they can work on improving. But that's a quick guide that'll help you. And that's it for me.
Well, thank you, Sue. If we have a couple, I think we still have a little time for some questions. So, staff, we have any questions for Sue?
Thank you, Mr. Feldman. The first question is, if we elevate repetitive loss properties, will that improve our score?
Yeah, that would be creditable in Activity 520, acquisition and relocation. You can get credit there. I really can't say how much credit it would be. It all depends on how big your floodplain is and other items. But yeah, if you elevate repetitive loss structures and mitigate that, then one, you'll improve your score, and two, you can probably get that property removed from your repetitive loss list.
Okay. Amber, next question.
Are you saying that a home with a non-federally backed mortgage cannot get CRS discounts even though they are still in the same CRS community and are in the floodplain?
Right, because they're already subsidized rates. You're already getting a good discount if you're not in the flood hazard area. I mean, I'm just going to use this as an example. You take about your typical 1,600 square foot home that's in that's basically a slab on grade, and it's sitting in the high hazard area, and you have a mortgage on it. Your flood insurance, the NFIP, is going to be $700 to $800 a year. Pick up that same home and put it in the X zone for the 500-year floodplain, and your insurance is going to be about $350 to $400 a year. So you're already getting like a huge discount on it anyway.
Okay. Amber, do we have one more question?
Yes. How many property owners would want or could get a mortgage that's not federally backed?
I have no idea. I'm so sorry I can't answer that question. I don't know what funding is available out there that's not federally backed.
Okay, one more quick question. What is the link for the NFIP data that was just provided?
What is the link?
The link.
The web link.
Oh, for the what if? That's a secure FEMA website. You'd have to request that information. If you're not a CRS community, you'll need to email somebody at FEMA Region 4. And if you are a CRS community, you can either email me or your ISO CRS specialist if you know who that is in your area. I am so sorry. They just decided to start mowing and leaf blowing my yard.
Okay. Well, that's a good opportunity for me just to start our conclusion then. We heard from Flood Administration for FEMA Administrator David Miller, and he talked a little bit about the Bigger Waters Act and what impact it's going to have. And he concluded by basically saying one of the programs we ought to be taking a look at is the community rating system. And Sue walked us through the community rating system program. And I encourage all communities to take that quick look, if you're not part of the CRS, to see if you are undertaking the right activities. And if you are part of the CRS program, to look at how you can be improving your rating, because those will be dollars that are passed on directly to your property owners in your community. So I want to thank everybody today for participating in the flood insurance webinar hosted by the Florida League of Cities. I especially, again, want to take a moment to thank Administrator David Miller and Sue Hoffensberger for their insightful and informative presentations. And at this time, the webinar has concluded. But don't forget, you can review the recorded version posted on the Florida League of Cities website. Thank you again.
Thank you.